So I'd like to introduce Marianne, Clark and Clare Southerton, who will be presenting a paper called Lingering in the Bad Feelings for Good Reason. What might bad feelings do? So thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Marianne Clark, and this is my wonderful colleague, Clare Southerton.
Hello.
And we will be co-presenting today. So I'm going to take the first half of the presentation, and then we'll switch it over as smoothly possible to Clare. And we are from UNSW, the Vitalities Lab at UNSW. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen now. Of course, it's not working as easily as I thought.
It's there now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So our presentation is titled Lingering in the Bad Feelings for Good Reason. What might bad feelings do? And I want to say a thank you to all the organizers for this wonderful symposium, and to our wonderful keynote, Simone, yesterday, and Sean today. Seeing your talk in particular is a really nice jumping off point for our talk today. I'd like to acknowledge that we are both speaking we live and work on the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and that the Gadigal and Bidjigal people are the true custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and we extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. We also wanted to just think about the context of the symposium and the themes explored, and we believe it's important to acknowledge that these people's ongoing fight for sovereignty on this land and the significant collective emotional burden of this fight we want to acknowledge and extend our solidarity with them in this fight. So, what does hope offer and what does hope close off? This paper reflects our thinking on the capacities of hope in the context of COVID pandemic, and it emerges from both of our visceral responses to the idea of being hopeful and our subsequent readings and conversations that unfolded over Slack, over text messages, over the phone, over several months. We situate and start to consider our responses both in the context of COVID and alongside feminist literature that has interrogated and articulated the important role of bad feelings and negative affects that exist in tension and in dialogue with positive affects like hope. And some of these tensions have been acknowledged in previous presentations. At the time this call for papers circulated, we were weeks away from the Delta outbreak in Sydney, and we were living in a relatively hopeful time, you could say. As the screen grab of The Guardian from around that time shows, Melbourne was coming out of a recent lockdown. So there were signs of hope, at least close to home. Vaccines were slowly rolling out and outbreaks were remaining relatively small. However, the pandemic, as the term suggests, is global. And we know it has affected people in our own communities unevenly, as well as those living in different social, political, and environmental conditions around the world. And so Clare and I shared and discussed our similar shared visceral responses to the notion of hope. And as we noticed a sense of unease and discomfort, that hope might present yet another pandemic project that we ought now to pursue, a normative and socially desirable orientation that we ought to be working towards, all the while still making sense or trying to make sense of the pandemic and the grief, fear, rage, and anxiety that came and continues to come with it. Despite everything that hope as a collective effective force can offer, a reprieve from the horrors of the pandemic being one of them, it felt too soon and a bit too tidy. There was a sense of being rushed and of leaving behind some difficult, messy, but extremely important problems untended in order to move on to a more comfortable, alluring, and social acceptability space of hope. I remember feeling an overwhelming urge to say, wait, we are not all ready to hope. Not long after that moment, it seemed we were indeed not ready to hope, as Sydney was plunged into strict lockdown with COVID case numbers rising relentlessly and seemingly no end in sight as Delta took hold. The atmosphere continued to get heavier. We watched our daily press conferences. We mourned the fate of our office plants, now most certainly withered and dead, and marveled and laughed at our optimism for bringing them in the first place. We doom scrolled news feeds and Twitter every once in a while, making promises to each other on Slack saying, we're going to stop doing this, but we continued. And we noted that the press conferences were filled with familiar messages trying to instill hope. Do the right thing, get vaccinated, stay home, we will get back to normal, we will get our lives back. So thinking about hope in this context and what it does, we know it is often embraced and then deployed in ways that imply a moving forward, a looking towards the future. And it can imply a sort of linearity, a sort of forward thrusting trajectory that resonates with humanist narratives of progress. And this gave us pause. We notice this particularly in the colloquial usage of hope, and we argue it's difficult to theorize hope without acknowledging the way hope is and can be co-opted by normative capitalist and neoliberal systems, which has been noted by others today and yesterday. But we also notice this in the context of neoliberal academia and contemporary feminism. As precariously employed early and mid-career scholars, we sometimes feel an imperative to be hopeful and enact and perform hopeful orientations, even though a range of messier and more difficult effective responses, rage, grief, despair, anxiety, are more readily within reach right now. We also noticed we were bothered by persistent questions that weren't being asked as much as we would have hoped around the socio-material conditions, context, and power relations in and through which discussions of hope are embedded and enacted. For whom is it possible to hope? What are the conditions for hope and who has access to them? And who gets to be a hopeful subject? Questions that Scene raised earlier today. Rosie Braidotti suggests hope could be understood as a collective affect that mobilizes capacities for change with both generative and destructive consequences. But given our visceral unease, or what Clare Hemmings names affective dissonance, when presented with the idea of hope, we wondered what the dangers might be of positioning hope as always desirable. What is lost or foreclosed in the future orientation of hope? We consider this question through the work of feminist and queer theorists who have provided compelling critiques of the neoliberal appropriation of optimism and hope. Lauren Berlant, whose work has been cited a lot in the last 2 days, their well-known concept of cruel optimism is insightful here. To think about the way that cultural imperatives to be optimistic and oriented toward positive affects is actually and can be toxic and exhausting. Berlant's work resonates with that of Sarah Ahmed's critique of happiness that draws explicit attention to the power relations at play. For Ahmed, happiness is political rather than personal, and is more easily accessible to those people and groups in privileged social and cultural positions. Ahmed argues the face of happiness looks rather like the face of privilege. And we wonder if the same can be said of hope and what needs to be done to ensure it does not. We suggest this requires what Ahmed calls a form of political labor. We further suggest this labor involves resisting social imperatives to move on from uncomfortable or bad feelings, and instead to acknowledge the potential generativity of staying with them and resisting normalizing forces. As Ahmed says, we have to stay with the feelings that we might wish would go away. I now pass it over to Claire, who will explore a little more about the bad feelings.
Thank you, Marianne. So as Marianne noted, both of us felt a sense of resistance or tension to the timelines of hope. So in the context of COVID-19, when grief, loss, devastation, intense stress seemed ever present but unevenly experienced, it felt perhaps too soon to hope. There was a shared concern that hope, or the impetus to hope and be hopeful, meant moving through the tough stuff too quickly. Is the sadness, fear, anxiety, stress of lockdowns, death, isolation, and sharpened inequalities soothed with the balm of hope? Or can the bad feelings themselves offer us something? As we have discussed, hope is often seen as the impetus for change with its future orientation. The typical image of this might be the famous street poster of US presidential candidate Barack Obama, who went on to win the election and serve 2 terms. I think we're all familiar with that famous image. Hope elicits a sense of momentum, often political and productive, towards a better future. While dwelling on what is bad, sad, unpleasant, and painful is often seen as unproductive and unhelpful. As James Burford astutely comments, feelings that are interpreted as positive and strong, such as hope and optimism, are often seen as resources with political potential, whereas weak or bad feelings, such as depression, numbness, and anxiety, are often written off as political liabilities. Queer theorist Heather Love's work is also useful here. Love argues that queer scholars cannot dismiss bad feelings, such as shame and despair, in queer history as useless to political action. As Love puts it, the politics of optimism diminishes the suffering of queer historical subjects. At the same time, it binds us to the continuities between past and present. As long as homophobia continues to centrally structure queer life, we cannot turn away from the past. Instead, we have to risk the turn backwards, even if it means opening ourselves to the social and psychic realities we would rather forget. Taking Love's thinking to our present example of the COVID-19 pandemic, looking back at the pain of the pandemic and seeing the important ways that it continues to organize the present can be powerful, especially as the notion of COVID normal continues to elude us. Things don't feel normal. Love's call to turn backwards, even if it is painful, seems especially pertinent. James Burford's work takes up Love's concepts, and along with others, and looks at academic activism, arguing that feelings like sadness and depression can be agentic and resistant. This is not, Burford is careful to note, to advocate for being sad or depressed, but rather to take a more generous interpretation of the many modes in which subjects engage in resistance and politics. In a time when institutions and workplaces use happy hour Zoom drinks to cultivate a sense of life as normal during a global pandemic, often as a thin veneer for neoliberal ends, it is productive to think about how refusing joy and sitting in sadness may be a resistant act. Hope can be an overpowering force, propelling us towards a linear model of progress that can close off the possibilities of these less clear and less positive feelings. As we all have likely observed as workers in the neoliberal academy, hope can easily be co-opted during the pandemic, hoping to return to normal without interrogating who that normal serves. It's important to note that in this arrangement, hope is often oriented around a return to productivity. In contrast, dwelling in the bad feelings and trying to creatively and ethically respond to unhopeful conditions requires time, energy, and resources that do not align with or support neoliberalism or capitalist aims. As emerging scholars navigating our ways through precarious employment, we also note that to be hopeful is very acceptable and a desirable positioning. This creates a socially and politically charged impetus to overlook and move on from any sort of affective dissonance in order to hope and be hopeful. But in this movement, who is left behind and what is left unattended to? At times, being a good feminist also feels like one should be oriented towards hope and empathy rather than staying with the trouble, the bad feelings, or being a feminist killjoy. The good neoliberal feminist academics turn the lemons of the pandemic into the lemonade of hope, aka publications. We've all read those faculty-wide emails about how lockdown is a good time to write. Of course, good and bad feelings can and do exist alongside each other. Of course, this is not a new idea. Our experience of opening up here in Sydney, for example, have been entangled experiences of joy, optimism, fear, relief, frustration, and a range of other feelings that are in constant flux. The ambiguous in-between layers of emotions of the pandemic can and already have offered some moments of fruitful respite from the extremes of hope and despair. I think humour is one such example that I think we'd like to leave you with. A way that we can kind of bring together these sort of messy feelings that don't necessarily resolve into either being hopeful or despairing. So this is a tweet from journalist Naman Zhao that I saw during the Sydney lockdown, when the lockdown was really starting to ramp up, making light of the fact that a contact location that was originally listed as Michelle's Patisserie was later corrected to Michael's Charcuterie, which is a really exclusive meat shop that gave me a lot of joy. So throughout the pandemic, I think humour has been a resource for many, a way to bring together these contradictory, layered and ambiguous feelings without necessarily feeling the push to hope for something better. And I'll end it there.
Thank you, Claire and Marianne. That was really great. I really like the idea that we, we need to create space to sort of sit with the bad feelings and explore how they, you know, might be productive. But I think Jazz has a question. So,
hi. Thanks so much for this presentation. It was really superb, as Sandy wrote in the chat. I really enjoyed it. And I think we can all relate to the exhaustion of Zoom drinks, but I do hope that some of us stick around maybe for a little bit this afternoon. I guess I was really grabbed by your point on receiving university emails telling you that it's a great time to be writing because you're in lockdown at the moment. And I wanted to, because I think you're both ECR-ish, and I kind of wanted to invite some reflections, if possible, on the fact that, you know, at the start of the pandemic, there was this kind of, I don't know, I felt like there was a real push to, you know, minimize the demands on people to be productive, really be understanding about how hard it is in lockdown. And then it became all these institutional demands times 100, where we're still waiting for deadlines for grants. We're still being asked to produce and to be more and more productive and to generate research. I've been to meetings where people would say things like, we're all COVID researchers now. We all have to be writing on it. So I wonder a bit, in the context of thinking about bad feelings and having a bit of a love-hate relationship with our jobs, some of us are privileged enough to have jobs, what would your insight be around what sort of bad feelings the university has worked to go against, but then produced and reproduced?
That is a great question, especially because I feel like the notion that we're all COVID researchers is sort of a tricky one because in a way COVID has touched almost every aspect of our lives, so it's sort of impossible to avoid talking about it. But at the same time, yeah, I do feel the kind of problems of sort of turning too soon, I think, to turn what is, I think, like a very sensitive, like what, especially, you know, when we're talking about people who've lost their lives, topic into kind of neat projects and products for the university. And I think you're absolutely right that in the early days, there was a sense that like when something could be potentially very temporary, it's a problem that the university is willing to create space for. But when it's a prolonged and, you know, more expensive thing, then, you know, the more expensive it becomes, the less we are willing to see it as a kind of, you know, we're not willing to change the conditions of a university. We're much more willing to see a temporary event as excusable. We're not willing to change, you know, what people's workloads are. I don't know if you have any reflections, Marianne.
No, I think that was a good summary, Claire. What did strike me was the sort of temporality of it, that there was this sort of initially sense of understanding and a goodwill, because we didn't know. There's so, you know, so much uncertainty this pandemic has been characterized by uncertainty, so we didn't know. And then you sort of felt the tone shift. And of course, a university is sort of, you know, a system of business embedded in complex structures, and certain things need to happen. But that every sort of individual within that system has very specific circumstances. So yeah, so it's really difficult to navigate. But the neoliberal imperative definitely came through stronger and stronger as time went by.
Great. So I think Roger has a question for you both.
Yeah, thank you. Really nice presentation. Great. I guess my question is about, like, I really like the idea of it's okay to sort of sit with bad or ambivalent feelings and sort of allow them to be, particularly in these times. But I also just immediately sort of think about how for some people bad and difficult feelings are a real warning sign and that shouldn't be sat with. I mean, I deal with loneliness research, and one of the interesting findings that's coming out of the UK at the moment is that the least lonely people got less lonely during COVID because they were able to reach out and connect with others more easily. Whereas the most lonely people got a lot more lonely, and they're in pretty bad shape, I imagine. And so what I'm trying to say is just simply when do we sit with the bad feelings versus raise the alarm? And is that itself linked to our privileged positions and whether we're marginalised or not? Just your comments would be nice. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. And I think there's lots of different sort of layers to be addressed there, but so bad feelings are often pathologized and in comparison in relationship to affective, or hope. And I talk about the colloquial, the kind of sort of hallmark card quality that hope can have in sort of everyday life. But hope as an affect can prompt movement. And we are critiquing sort of that assumed linearity of something better. But bad feelings can also prompt movement and transformation and change. And so there is a generativity to bad feelings as well. So yes, dwelling or staying still is perhaps not where the kind of potential of bad feelings comes from, but what can they tell us as well? And if we move on too quickly from them without addressing what might be causing them, for lack of a better way of putting it, then I think that's where the danger comes in. But yeah, that's a very, very good point. And it's, yeah, the end goal is not to bad feelings to be there forever, but to acknowledge them, to sort of open up this idea of it's not just hope, but hope is not the only good thing, and hope is not always good. Bad feelings can be generative too, and we have to be sort of careful and ethical in how we respond to them.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting, just from my very subjective experience of the pandemic, is the way that sometimes bad feelings can be a way of connecting with other people. Like if you're having a really terrible time and you can just reach out to someone and say, I'm just having such a terrible time. And I think, loneliness, of course, like you say, is very complex because people who are isolated tend to remain isolated because of sometimes social conditions vastly out of their control. But I think sometimes the push to be hopeful can be isolating because you feel like, okay, I don't feel like that. I don't feel hopeful. Maybe something's wrong with me. So I think, yeah, there's sometimes the bad feelings can be a way of building connections with other people who also are feeling the same way.
Okay, thank you both. I think we're at 20 minutes now. And there's a question from Simone, Dion, and a few other comments. So you might want to check out the chat and keep that discussion going. But